You know, I came into comics at a time when people were doing what I would call deconstruction, you know, stuff like Watchmen and Dark Knight and some of the things that followed them, which were breaking down the hero and examining what it might be like to be a superhero in a real world. Yes. I kind of went in and wanted to do the opposite, you know. Those guys were bringing heroes into our world, and I kind of wanted to see what it was like in the world of the heroes and what it would be like to live in a place where the skies were primary colour blue and where time cuts between panels and where your entire universe can be erased by some guy's whim. Yes. So rather than bringing realism in, I wanted to be more like a superhero. Yeah. So my kind of approach was to try and find the root of them and build them back up and bring out the heroism again, and the fact that it's just so beautiful to me that people who live in a kind of world, or a messed up world, shall we say, create these amazing characters who are so much better than us, you know. So I wanted to deal with that aspect of them rather than break them down or drag them down to be like us.
So, for the last year or so, I have been thoroughly immersed in the world of comic books. That has completely changed not only how I perceive art and how I consume it, but my entire worldview, how I look at literally everything. And when I say that I have been immersed in the world of comic books, I am primarily talking about the work of one Grant Morrison. Their work and their in its entirety and its different eras and the way that these things kind of mesh together and intermingle has completely transformed how I think about that medium and every medium in my own life, and informed my practice, my burgeoning practice with magic, and just kind of changed everything about how I view everything. And specifically, their work within the DC universe, spanning from the mid to late 80s all the way until now, in kind of an ongoing process that nevertheless manages to call back to itself across years and decades and evolve in ways that I couldn't have predicted, I guess, if I saw where they started and where they ended up. So I hope to get into all of that, but very briefly to start things off and kind of contextualize everything. A brief history of the comic book medium, specifically as it relates to superheroes and the way that I see that. So, first of all, we've got the Golden Age, of course, from 1938 to roughly 1945, the end of World War II. It roughly tracks onto that war, which I believe holds a lot of symbolism in terms of the cultural consciousness and where things were at that time. So, of course, we have the emergence of Superman in 1938, and the rough decline of the Golden Age comes with the end of World War II, but specifically the dropping of the bombs, the atomic age, which is what I call the next part. Most people say the Golden Age goes from 38 to 56, where the Silver Age begins. I segment it into 1938 to 1945 for the Golden Age, and then 1946 to 1955 for what I call the Atomic Age. This is when genre fiction takes over and the superhero fades out of mainstream popularity just a bit, right? And these things run in cycles. So you can look at the Atomic Age as mirroring the later Bronze Age, mirroring the Ultimate Age, so on and so forth, in terms of first there being kind of a more optimistic era, and then followed by a more pessimistic era, with kind of a shifting interest that both the writers are pursuing and the audience is interested in. So again, we have the Atomic Age from 46 to 55. And again, this is when we have different genre fiction. And the rough decline of the Atomic Age comes because of the Comics Code, of course, and this kind of panic around the influence of comics, around their appropriateness. There then becomes, the fabled code that censors comics and makes it much harder to have adult content in these things. So there is a reemergence of superheroes, and The interesting ways that writers got around the censorship kind of informs the tone of the Silver Age, which becomes more significant than probably any other era in defining what these superheroes would be going forward in the popular consciousness. So Silver Age is from 56 to 69, right? Roughly the appearance of Barry Allen as the Flash, right, in the classic costume, all the way into about 1970 with the end of Vietnam, which emerges the Bronze Age. So the Silver Age, as we'll come back to when we're analyzing Morrison, is known for being a bit sillier, a bit more Freudian. And the Bronze Age is when comics, quote unquote, starts to grow up, starts to examine more dark themes. There's the lifting of the Comics Code around this time, which means that writers can kind of take on what's considered more adult themes. And there's kind of getting away from the optimism of the Silver Age, the kind of weirdness, into something a bit more realistic. Right, which culminates with the Dark Age in 85 to 98, which is when comics really get serious, right? When the work of Alan Moore in kind of the late Bronze Age and the early Dark Age kind of influences the whole thing to collide, to cave in on itself, right? There's this boom in popularity in the early 90s of superheroes and specifically the image model of what a superhero looks like, right? You've got the 90s kind of, radical look, all of these pouches and guns and all of that, the stuff we make fun of, right? And then the end of the Dark Age is around 98. That's from here on out, it's purely me kind of making up these eras and segmenting off things to the best of my ability. But the end of the Dark Age comes with the Ultimate Age from 99 to 2010. And at this point, the idea is that we've got more cinematic kind of storytelling. The form changes in that mode. Comic books are generally meant more to be trades, right? You had kind of the emergence of the graphic novel throughout the Dark Age, and by the Ultimate Age, kind of all of comics are being written and formatted around the collection. There's more of an idea that comics are kind of more like serialized television shows, which are also taking off around this time. And you've even got screenwriters from those industries who are coming in and making comic books. So the Ultimate Age from 99 to 2010 is kind of this attempt to reconcile the darker elements of comics that have come to completely swallow them with the earlier roots and kind of the sillier and more optimistic comic books of the Silver Age and Golden Age. And what I call the New Age is from 2011 to roughly now. We may be kind of emerging into something different, but the main thing that defines the New Age is, one, the move from print to digital for comic books, right? Most consumption is done digitally at this point. And I believe the New Age comes with further attempts to reconcile, and more successful attempts to reconcile these darker tones and these sillier tones, and to find something that's kind of a more diverse presentation of what comic books can be. The idea that they're more for everyone, and also the primary comic book companies kind of trying to stretch their hands into other genres, the dominance of the MCU model, kind of mirroring that and taking over what previously had been different genre markets within cinema. And in the New Age, we kind of have the emergence of both the lack of a monoculture and also superheroes as monoculture for a very brief moment. So there's kind of an interesting interplay going on between what's going on in the comic book medium and the much more popular and consumed films and later TV shows. And that's about as far as I've gotten, and as far as we have gotten into the history of this medium, right? It's spanning almost 100 years, and over the course of that, you have so many different historical developments and market developments. And again, this is specifically just looking at the history of superhero fiction, which I believe is pretty obviously the most important genre and the most important sets of characters within this medium over the last 100 years that we're going to look at. Which, now that we have all of this context, I can start to properly talk about Grant Morrison. And again, I will not be talking about Grant Morrison's entire body of work and career, partially because I haven't consumed all of it, and partially because I want to focus in specifically on their work with DC, as I find not even necessarily what they write about, but how they write within this shared universe to be endlessly fascinating and probably the single most interesting body of work out there, in the sense that it's not just their body of work, but part of this much larger continuous story that just stretches back a billion pages in one direction and infinitely into the future. And here in the center is the words of one person, which, no matter how complex and insane and all-encompassing thematically their stuff can get, it never even feels like a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things. There's this constant tension across their work at DC between someone who understands that they are just a conduit for these characters that dozens of people have already had their takes on before, and for all they know, hundreds and hundreds could have their takes on in the future, versus a person who wants to, within a self-contained work, have this everlasting impact on these characters and this universe, and make statements that work on their own in a self-contained way. And it's fascinating how that kind of develops over their career of work with DC. So I wanted to talk about them first emerging in the mid to late 80s with Animal Man at DC, all the way to Flex Mentallo in 96 as kind of the first branch, the first leg of what I've segmented into 3 parts of their work with DC. And what's interesting about this early work that they have is primarily the way that it uses tone that contradicts kind of what they would do in the second and third branches of their career, in the sense that the first branch is significantly more in line with its era, being the Dark Age, and as a result much more pessimistic. It's not quite as developed metatextually in terms of its understanding of this world, so you have a lot more darkness and death and despair, and a lot of what they wrote around this time works really well as tragedy, with oftentimes comedy being kind of the short-term tone, but tragedy being the longer-term result. And hopefully that'll make sense once I kind of get into some of the work. I'm not going to cover literally all of it because it's too many things, but I will cover choice moments, choice issues, and concepts that kind of interrelate and display what's so special about their work, specifically in this first leg of their career. And again, this goes across from 88 to 96, covering major works: Animal Man, Doom Patrol, 2 issues of the long-running JLA series Secret Origins, that being 46 and 50. Of course, Batman Arkham Asylum, the thing that put them into superstardom. Batman Gothic, which I am not going to talk about. Swamp Thing, Root of All Evil, which I am also not going to talk about. And finally, again, Flex Mentallo, which was a spin-off of sorts from Doom Patrol and kind of caps off that first branch and leads into the next. So starting with Animal Man, which I am not going to cover in its entirety because it's just too many different concepts and issues, and frankly, I think a lot of its ideas are developed better later. A lot of it is famously known for being metatextual, but in much more blunt and less complex ways, in my opinion, than their later work, specifically in the middle period. But I do want to specifically talk about, of course, Animal Man number 5, and how the germ of an idea of kind of how these characters work as real, right? When taken actually realistically as fictional characters rather than realistically as real life characters, how you can get into deeper concepts than just, pure death and destruction and these shallower ideas of what reality really is. So Animal Man number 5, famously, the Coyote Gospel, is essentially about this cartoon character, literally like Wile E. Coyote, like modeled specifically after him, kind of moves from this lower world into the upper world as a form of punishment, a form of purgatory, because they were fed up with this endless cycle of violence and rebirth in their cartoon reality, and therefore they go into this upper reality, which is the world of DC and that universe, which at the time is, of course, slightly more detailed and capital R realistic, in the sense that everything is a little bit more mirroring our reality in terms of lack of simplicity and drawn detail. And they go into our world, and Morrison kind of touches on this idea of endless death and resurrection as a trait of both the lower cartoon world and the upper world, right? It's a tragedy, again, within the framework of a ultimately comedic and hopeful world, which they do not get into within Animal Man, but which they get into in the meta-narrative of their entire work within this company. So already in the first major outlier of this Animal Man run, they are getting into themes of creating a better world, mentioned in this comic book as kind of the driving force behind the Coyotes' rebellion against God and against the rules of the reality, and trying to reconcile this nonsensical world with the need to make sense of things. The idea that there are higher beings that are influencing them, and the characters within this reality are trying to rebel against those confines, right? The idea that when you confine a fictional character into certain limitations, rather than letting them exist on their own and within their own rules, that this leads to tragedy. It leads to, I believe, bad art. And again, Morrison kind of gets into this in their own Super Gods book about how they try to channel the characters rather than impose their own views onto them, which isn't to say that they don't have very clear views that do come out in these characters, but in a larger sense, they try to let the characters do the talking and kind of guide, I believe, their views, to tell a story that incorporates their views through the very specific voices of the characters they tell their stories with. So again, we've got these themes of death and resurrection and the need to transform and kind of break out of your own confines, and following up with an issue of Doom Patrol number 35, in which Robot Man becomes separated from their robot body, right? They're just a brain in a jar, and their robot body begins to rebel against them, begins to want more than what they have been given up to this point. There's this interplay throughout the issue of the mind and body and the interruption of violence ultimately solving the dilemma, right? It ends in kind of this, again, comic tragedy by the end of the issue that works kind of ironically, because you essentially have a body rebelling against its mind, and at the same time you have a gorilla working with a separate mind that is a conscious mind to put that mind into the body of Robot Man, who is again separated now from their robot body. So at the end, there is this reconciliation between mind and body, but it's a different mind and body. A mind that has now been put into a body that they obviously appreciate more than Robot Man did. And they are able to find love with the gorilla in this new body. And interestingly, I do want to get into real quick the history of gorillas as they come to become a motif within Morrison's work, and I kind of want to touch on the prevalent examples of them. Gorillas, if you didn't know, were very prevalent on comic book covers in the Silver Age because they supposedly, this may be a myth, but it nonetheless holds up to the prevalence of these covers. Gorillas on covers sold more comics, so you end up with a lot of long-lasting gorilla characters in the DC universe as a result of pure capitalism, purely trying to sell comic book covers by putting gorillas into these things. So a lot of the time, Morrison's use of gorillas, I believe, is a way to comment on kind of the Silver Age contradiction and absurdity of the DC universe, this interplay between absurdity and symbolism and capitalism, right? The drive to create purely for profit versus these kind of crazy thematic things that can happen despite and sometimes even because of this chase for profit. Again, getting back to the Silver Age, you've got a lot of things that were put onto covers purely to sell, purely creating the most absurd situations possible just to sell something off a stand. But in this process, you end up with such great works of art that you can get a lot out of, despite the conditions in which it was made and the motivations behind its creation. Nevertheless, the fiction exists, and now we have to engage with it. Right, so going back to the works and everything, again, we have mind versus body, bodies in conflict with minds. And moving on to Secret Origins, number 46, the very low stakes kind of backup issue type of style here is kind of the side story about Flash's costume rebelling against the Flash, the costume, the clothes, the body rebelling against the person, the mind. And I cannot remember how this is resolved. I just thought that was, worth noting, I guess, as one of their only Flash stories ever, that's what they chose to do with it. And again, returning back to Doom Patrol, we have, again, stories and characters that they themselves created that exhibit this kind of conflict between minds and bodies and consciousness. We have Rebus, of course, the person who is two people, the mergence of two different consciousnesses, which constantly across the title is mispersoned, I guess, by both people who knew the people they were before they fused, just consistently. And it's very clear that they consider themselves a kind of new being with a new distinct name that they want to be called. And they're just completely okay with this. And everyone else eventually has to try to learn to be cool with this too. Again, minds, bodies, things happening with those conflicts, the works. But before I get into kind of the culmination of this first leg of their work, I do, of course, want to touch specifically on Arkham Asylum, which I believe is, weirdly enough, kind of an outlier in their entirety of their work, just in terms of its general tone and kind of the things it plays with. It's one of the more distinctly tragic things that they've ever done within the DC universe, like not even a touch of comedy really across it. I mean, obviously dark comedy, but no capital C comedy anywhere in that. And it stands even apart from, again, Batman Gothic, which I will still not talk about, but which is, for all intents and purposes, a very run-of-the-mill Batman story. And even their later Batman run, which, again, kind of, this works as almost a keystone too, but it doesn't really connect all that well, I feel like, in terms of their vision of what Gotham is and kind of how it relates to the Batman. Until you like actually engage with it, I guess, in the way that it very plainly states that it should be engaged with. Arkham Asylum is a story about how to engage with art. Not so much about, I guess, okay, well, let me put it this way. It's not so much about the complexity of the characters in Batman's world so much as it is about teaching you how to read a comic book. Like taking these Batman characters, which are at their core symbols of one or two concepts made, incredibly obvious visual metaphor, right? Taking those things and kind of challenging you to consume these stories all like that, to engage with the symbols directly in front of your face, rather than stories as stories of characters in conflict with one another and plot events. To just look at it as symbols. And I think that's really cool. Arkham Asylum, essentially, in terms of mirroring other works that they had done up to this point, there is the resurrection into a different world, another world, right? You have transitioning across different universes within this and other works at this time. And you have kind of this idea across it that the observation of the resurrection, the observation of the character on the page, is what essentially creates them, creates their reality. And every time you're observing a page or an event, you are in turn playing a part, an active part in making it happen. Again, these would be played with much later in their career than this, but this is kind of the building blocks that you would later use. This is, again, kind of a keystone to their entire oeuvre across several decades, right? A very simple Batman story about them going into Arkham Asylum and fighting all of the different villains and all of that stuff, but it's actually just playing for symbolism, right? Everything is a symbol. It's challenging you again to, just like tarot cards, which play a role in the story, in which kind of brush up against Two-Face's symbolism of the coin flip, right? But with endlessly more complex permutations and combinations of symbols, that plays a huge role in kind of how this story plays out, right? It's essentially a war of symbols. What is the most the strongest and the most important symbol? Batman would argue that he is, so that's why he wins the day ultimately, because he is the strongest symbol, right? And Arkham Asylum and the Batman mythos, which oddly enough this does persist across their work even as the rest of it kind of evolves, is a tragedy within a world of hope and comedy. That's what makes it so unique. And when we get into their later, much longer Batman run with all of its complexities, that's going to be kind of an overarching idea that we have to contend with there. The idea of this one seed of tragedy, no matter what you do, this fatalism within this larger universe of hope and good as entropy, right? As an entropy that you move towards no matter what you do. Another thing that I wanted to briefly touch on is that in line with kind of the more, I guess, juvenile, 'cause, like, their work at this point is still what I would call very developed, very mature and genius, but it also has a lot more of the trademarks of what I would refer to as things that are juvenile ideas of genius across them. And again, that's kind of a reflection of the times, of the Dark Age, and specifically of the postmodernism prevalent of this time. You can look at like their later protege, Mark Millar, as kind of the torchbearer of this early, more juvenile inclinations that they had within their work. For specifically, one of the lower forms of postmodern deconstruction, which is just blatant parody, right? Just insert an obvious parody of something into this and make a very blunt point about it by making, you know, your Superman dark or your Avengers team corrupt people. And not that these can't be brilliant stories unto themselves, but what's interesting about this first leg of Morrison's work is that for the most part, everything that they deal with after this is played very straight and deals with the proper characters to tell these stories and make these points, whereas a lot of their earlier work very blatantly deals with parody to make the points that they're trying to make. And this culminates, again, in this kind of contradiction of these juvenile and more genius and later impulses, Flex Mentallo, which is segmented into 4 different issues that tell about the gold, silver, dark, and like the emergent future age of the comic book medium as Morrison saw it at that time. And interestingly enough, there are a few more themes of body and mind in conflict. Specifically at this point, they are dealing with kind of fictional realities and art and the creation of art and LSD and drug transformations, and drawing a lot from the Silver Age and retroactively commenting on the symbolism of that age to talk about these bodily transformations and transformations of consciousness and all of that going on. And at the end of the day, most notably, in their emergent new age that points to where their work is going to go within the DC universe going forward, there is this last shot of humanity transcending its boundaries and all flying up in the air as superheroes. The idea that the fictional superhero and its symbiotic relationship with us, these universes, can have a positive influence on us, can help us to discover new capacities within ourselves, not just in a metaphorical way, but in a literal way, is the way that they're talking about this. And interestingly enough, this shot of all of the people flying up in the air is going to come up later in rhyme, but it also rhymes within the context of Flex Mentallo, this earlier image of bombs flying across the sky, right? This tragic, realistic future that was so famously dealt with in the 80s by the work of Moore within the comics medium, that it was known for being, you know, so influential and serious and real worldy, versus the emergence of all of these heroes flying across the sky as an image of aspiration. And I will get into that more as we go forward, but one thing that they do continue to do in terms of parody is parody of the works of Alan Moore, often in increasingly subtle ways, but usually in very blatant ways, like straight up just having the end is near character in here. And this plays with kind of the conflict between this kind of optimistic view that our fictions can be aspirational towards us and don't necessarily have to reflect the real world, versus the idea that these fantasies should be deconstructed and taken apart, that they are distractions and escapism and, you know, in their own nature, juvenile and things to be grown out of, which, you know, you don't necessarily have to think that Moore thinks all the way, but you can look at their art and specifically the way it influenced other art within the medium in a negative way towards the latter path, towards the idea that in order for the superhero to survive within the Dark Age, it had to die, evolve, however you want to say it. It had to be deconstructed and taken into this kind of grim outlook, that the fascism inherent to a straightforward and, I would argue, rather limited reading of the superhero as a figure had to be the ultimate way that we kind of looked at these figures, that the most serious engagement with these characters, with these modern myths, was to be in a negative way, to look at these things as a thing to outgrow rather than a thing to more seriously and complexly analyzed for how we can be changed and change our fictions in turn. Okay, so moving right ahead, we are now in the second leg of Morrison's career with DC, and the meatiest, the one that I will probably spend the most time talking about, not because it's necessarily their best work, although I do think it is, but because it is the most intentionally intertextual, telling this grand narrative that does have a beginning, middle, and an end, and it is essentially, poetically, the attempt by Morrison to actually put their money where their mouth was and take that idea of where comic books were headed in their Flex Mentallo series and actually make it come to life through their work over the next decade. And again, this runs from 1996 to 2009, from their infamous run on JLA all the way up to the last issue of Final Crisis and Superman Beyond, and encapsulates a lot of their best known work, their most popular. At this time, they ended up essentially only working with the most popular and the flagship DC characters at a time when they were just coming out of their dark age and had been thoroughly deconstructed and in Superman's case killed, and then during their JLA run the attempt was made to reinvent them. They were seen as old hat and everything. And Superman, as you can probably guess, comes to embody like the avatar of Morrison's entire philosophy when it comes to the DC universe. This Boy Scout, as it were, which if anyone was, Superman would have been annihilated by the Dark Age, right? By this rampant deconstruction of these silly, idealistic versions of these superheroes, these escapist fantasies, and throughout this next leg, they would attempt, culminating in Final Crisis and All-Star Superman, of course, to kind of reconstruct the idea of Superman. This is where their work goes from most strictly deconstructionist, postmodern, to metamodern, reconstructionist, right? Everything across this leg is attempting to kind of recreate the DC universe pillar by pillar by embracing archetype and silliness and absurdity and kind of putting it on steroids, right? They very much embrace what I come to refer to as the Ultimate Age, in the sense that their storytelling also becomes significantly more cinematic and serialized and everything, right? More ripe for individual storylines than individual issues, as opposed to their last run. But at the same time, they are playing with the medium, not least of which because of their multiple partnerships with Frank Quitely, who will come up quite a bit. Flex Mentallo was drawn by Quitely, and I believe the first collaboration between Morrison and them. And their art just kind of complements Morrison's writing in a way that none other does. They are very, very precise. Their work has kind of this eerie perfection of anatomy and movement, and they're able to do things with the form through this kind of like very intentional rhythmic precision that I don't see in other artists. They're kind of like just the GOAT at being able to bring basically anything and any concept to life visually and through specifically sequential storytelling. That's like an important part of this. Is a lot of the time there's an emphasis on the best artists who can create the most complex artwork as the best comic book artists, and I think that that's a mistake in the sense that the sequential part is just as, if not more important than the individual drawings. In fact, it's significantly more important. The ability to kind of edit these images together and create emotions and instill feelings in the person reading through the interplay between the images is, I would argue, significantly more important than the individual images themselves and what is contained therein. But again, back to JLA and specifically kind of what Morrison's vision of that was. The idea was basically that the Justice League characters, if you didn't know, JLA, Justice League of America, should be like paragons of goodness, like strength, gods, things that we look up to and aspire toward. And they basically like baked that into the entire text. And at this point, rather than deconstructing characters to make them more complex, as in the first run of their work, and working with obscure characters and kind of plunging them from the depths to kind of add something to them, make their own mark on this universe through those tangential characters, they were now playing with the big characters and really embracing the strengths of archetypes, right? Of these very traditional and repetitive styles of storytelling that had been most prevalent in the Silver Age of comics. So like, I really, really, really want to emphasize the structure of these stories that they tell across their very lengthy run on JLA, because essentially every story is like one complication, one obstacle after another, and it keeps mounting and mounting and mounting until it's huge and insurmountable. And then essentially the more problems have accumulated, the bigger the problems, the more insurmountable they appear, the quicker they're resolved, right? Like there's a density to it, where like the problems exist essentially to be solved very quickly and very easily by the JLA, by these this pantheon of gods, these characters, right? There's a lot of all is lost moments, a lot of points at which you hit a point in the story where they've hit a wall and there's just everything has gone wrong, and they're torn down, and then they overcome it so like flawlessly a lot of the time that it reminds you like the strength of why we tell stories like this, right? Why, you know, you can subvert these stories and everything, but at the point that it's the norm, at the point that you don't tell these stories anymore, you've lost something. And, you know, to a certain degree, it takes a significantly less skilled writer to deconstruct these stories and offer a quote-unquote fresh take than to tell these stories that have been essentially told a million times and finds like angles and ways to create the most definitive versions of these stories that we've heard a million times, like to do it so well that you remember why you like these things in the first place, why it doesn't have to be that complicated or subversive or adult, right? For you to get something transcendent and new out of these things, to get something powerful out of it. And again, I do want to highlight that like metatextually, all of these stories across their run exist to show that these myths cannot be beaten in our own world, that the goodness that wins out in the DC universe, these heroes exist for a good reason, and that they are survivors, that the Dark Age and, you know, more specifically Moore's Miracle Man, whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, Killing Joke, these deconstructive storylines, Twilight of the Gods, right, which was never actually published but was meant to be kind of like the endpoint for these myths, cannot actually kill these characters, that they're unkillable because of reasons that I'll get into metatextually later when they make their points, right? And if we look at, you know, just the first arc as a thesis statement, we have these heroes who come from a different place, who pop out of nowhere and win over the people by solving all of their problems instantly. And the idea is like, oh, well, you know, if the Justice League has all of this power, why haven't they just done this to this point? You know, how can they exist and have all this power and be good and not simply solve all of humanity's problems or turn into authoritarians in the process? And it refutes that very succinctly with the Justice League defeating these people and them turning out to be imposters and everything, right? White Martians in this case. And, you know, the general thesis is that the Justice League doesn't exist in this universe and metatextually in ours to, you know, solve all of these problems and everything. They exist to protect humanity and help them grow and reach a new place, right? Again, signaling back to this image of all of the normal people, the superheroes in space going across the panel, which again, we'll come back to. And, infamously, in terms of new villains and everything that made a huge mark, there aren't, from my memory, a whole lot in JLA aside from Prometheus, whose power, whose function, more or less is literally deconstruction of the superheroes, right? He's able to defeat all of them initially by catching them off guard and knowing their exact weaknesses and everything. And specifically, he's a stand-in for an obsessive fan that thinks that they know better about these characters because they know all of the minutiae and everything. He's a big nerd who's memorized all of these things, and he's ultimately defeated by being segmented away from his helmet that tells him all of this information that feeds him skills that he hasn't actually earned, right? That he just kind of gets out of a helmet. So because Prometheus is ultimately a foil that is easily dismembered and everything, the meta-narrative is that these superheroes, can be deconstructed and survive that they can be hit from every angle and picked at and problematized and everything, but they are ultimately bigger than any given writer who tries to make that sort of mark, to take down the character, to kill the initial spirit of hope, because that's ultimately a law of this universe, as we'll come to find out. And again, I don't want to get too much into detail on JLA, specifically because it works so well as blockbuster, just generally good popcorn entertainment, to the point where you don't even really want to analyze it all that much. It's probably one of Morrison's most successful works in the sense that it was both able to be very popular and agreeable and also dense with all of this complexity and everything. And I think that again points to their strength as an artist in the sense that they can do both of those things at the same time better than a lot of artists can, right? There's a lot of complex artists, there's a lot of agreeable artists, there aren't a lot that can do both. And in many regards, I would argue that they even do popcorn entertainment better than a lot of these other less complex artists would do, because they fully embrace cliche archetype and just kind of maximalism in a way that a lot of other artists don't. So their run more or less ends with World War III and kind of this run up to what they would later explore with Final Crisis, with Darkseid and the New Gods and everything. So we'll kind of skim over that for right now and come back to that later. But I do want to talk about the 3 different titles that kind of came out of JLA: DC 1 Million, JLA Earth 2, and JLA Ultramarine Corps, which all 3 kind of act as appendixes and indexes that kind of recontextualize and add to the overall JLA run and bridge the gap between JLA and what Morrison would do later throughout the 2000s. First off, we have the event comic, their actual first event comic, in terms of a publisher-wide event, which is DC 1 Million, where the JLA goes really, really, really far into the future to visit their, not future selves, but future counterparts and everything, right? The people they've inspired for millennia. And again, we see that the entropy in this universe, goes towards good, just objectively, that is the law of the universe, that good always wins over evil, because within the DC universe, that is literally a law of reality in a way that it isn't over here, right? And that works to the advantage of the heroes, obviously. But it's this grand, incredibly optimistic tale that features a golden Superman who steps out of the sun and everything, that has been there for a very long time, and works as, if you want it to be, kind of the actual ending of All-Star Superman, if you view this specifically this middle part as one interconnected saga that all like literally takes place in the same universe, even though it's all like pulling from different stories and everything, and none of these technically connect, and all of them connect, if that makes any sense. On the other end of the stick, we have Earth 2, which is the more popular, I believe, of the stories, like one of the more popular ones that they wrote during their JLA turn, mostly because it's just like, you know, really archetypical and simple. And it's funny to me how like the animated version of this, like it misses the point like entirely, right? For like the sake of like, you know, just being agreeable, I guess, to like, you know, a kid teen audience in terms of how these stories are supposed to turn out. In the sense that like the movie version, and the comic version, the JLA like finds out about and interacts with this other universe where evil is like the norm, right? Like where there are counterparts of them that are evil, and they're like, you know, these tyrants and everything on their world. And again, in the movie, the ultimate point of this is that the JLA, you know, has this good influence on this world and ultimately like saves it and everything, right? But in the comic book, they basically find out that they can't do that, right? Like, because this other universe's laws work differently, they cannot influence it towards good. It is like immoral and bad to do that, not to mention fruitless in the long term. Which again points to like this interesting perspective that like within the reality of the DC universe, like Prime and everything, or what, you know, whatever you're calling it that day, within the main DC universe, yes, entropy does go towards good, but in another universe it could go towards bad, and that would be fine and respectable. It's like a different perspective on the whole nature of good versus evil and everything, as not reliant on some sort of independent source, but the fictional world itself to define what is and isn't good relatively. Which brings me to my next point, which is kind of beautifully illustrated like in a more direct way by Ultramarine Corps, which is that ultimately like the independent normal person, their imagination, their capacity to imagine a better world or a worse world is what defines how the world is shaped, right? Like it's a radical form of like, you know, thought-based materialism and everything, or, you know, whatever the term is, wherein like, you know, the collective consciousness of everyone, not specifically these betters or whatever, those people shape the universe and define its laws, right? That it could be seen, you know, on the one hand as like the writers imposing their will on it, but you could also look at it as these very real, normal people within this comic book world. Their capacity to imagine is what shapes their reality, what creates a good DC universe, right? Like if you look at even the difference between how DC and how Marvel typically depicts the normal populace in relation to the superheroes. The DC universe average citizen typically thinks the superheroes are really cool, right? Like genuinely believes that they can be good. And that's kind of what enables them to do what they do. Whereas in the Marvel universe, for the most part, people distrust, you know, mutants, Spider-Man, all of that sort of stuff. So there's kind of this fatalism to their causes because they don't largely have the support of popular imagination. I find that a really interesting way to look at it that I hadn't considered until I read Earth 2 in Ultramarine Corps, which brings us to another gorilla sighting, actually. Gorilla Grodd is one of the main villains of this one, which is kind of beside the point, and there's literally so much interconnected lore in this one. For 3 issues, it's like jam-packed with shit in it. That was gross. But there's a lot of stuff going on inside of this thing, and without even getting into that, keeping focused on kind of the metatextual aspects, the Justice League is at first trapped, except for Batman, who leads a robot version of like facsimiles of them against Gorilla Grodd. They are stuck in our universe and make observations that are in our universe there is no like dreams or hope except for in fiction. You know, wink, nudge. And when they escape and ultimately win the day, they end up sending this more paramilitary kind of force, the Ultramarine Corps, who don't mind killing, into our universe with the caveat that they have to actually inspire us, right? Like they have to survive within this barren wasteland where there are no dreams, which is our universe, and become better through that. And this is stuff that would be made more textual way later in Morrison's work. But for now, this is like them already playing around with kind of the idea of our actual universe as a pocket universe inside of the DC universe, right? Like, the other way around from how we would usually conceptualize it. And with that, I guess on to the big one. I do want to briefly talk about All-Star Superman, and I mean actually briefly, mostly because All-Star Superman is the one that everybody already knows about, loves, and thinks is amazing and everything. 2 points I want to make on that. So, for one, as illustrated in Super Gods, they got the idea for how Superman would act in this, which is consistent with how they act in, all of their work and everything. But each one of the 4 times that they've written Superman, they do take on a different flavor, a different way of carrying themselves. And, this specifically as the supposed definitive version and everything, Morrison always takes their writing assignments like very, very literally, which I love. In this case, the All-Star lines, supposedly being a definitive version of the character. They took that shit and ran with it. And they were inspired, for how Superman carries themselves in this by a cosplayer who they, for a brief period of time, thought was the real Superman, apparently, because they were just sitting as if nothing could hurt them, right? Like complete calmness, no aggression or anything in their voice or countenance. And I do largely agree with that interpretation of how a Superman, would portray themselves, this being that cannot be hurt or harmed, who just has complete hope and faith in humanity. Yeah, they would be pretty chill, I would imagine. Okay, and second thing that I wanted to get into, as everybody knows, All-Star Superman is about a Superman that is, supposedly dying, and in that process wants to get a bunch of shit done. Most of it is like callbacks or direct references to either actual things in the Silver Age or like the spirit of the Silver Age, and in many ways it's like a do-over of whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Kind of taking the idea of a final Superman story and rejecting that idea, showing that not only does Superman like love being Superman and like, it's not like a burden as it's written by Moore, more or less, that they don't in fact like end even in this ending, right? And that's important in 2 ways, in evidence 2 ways. One, because of course, you see the vision of Superman in the sun just, fixing it and coming back later, which again is textually supported by DC 1 million to have literally actually happened, right? Like Superman just went into the future, immortal, figured out, whatever shit was ailing him. It worked out. And of course, this also is, Lois being inspired by Superman, and as a extension, ourselves, the people within the DC universe, all of them being inspired. But more notably, the second thing, Lex Luthor, right? I've seen this theory go around, which somehow isn't like that prevalent, even though I think it's like literally like what the book is about, more or less. This scientist named Leo Quintum is a prevalent made-up character, specifically in All-Star Superman, who at the end of the book is trusted by Superman with the exact copy of his, genetic formula or whatever, like the ability to clone and carry on the Superman legacy, as has, literally already been proven to happen because of time travel and alternate descendants of Superman coming back, right? Which again is a very prevalent thing in the Silver Age, and like, part of the whole point of the whole optimistic entropy toward good universe. And the dialogue that Superman has with Leo Quintum is like really weird and knowing, and very clearly points to the idea that Lex Luthor, as in the text, there's a lot of questions around like his redeemability or irredeemability, and ultimately Leo Quintum is a time-traveled backward version of Lex Luthor who was ultimately turned to good, which points to kind of like the ultimate point of Superman and the DC universe as a whole, which again, in a world that has entropy towards good and that goes on forever, that people just keep writing stories and everything, eventually all of the villains are redeemed, right? Like that's the power of Superman. And again, by extension, all of us can be redeemed. All of us can be inspired and ultimately decide to make the right choices, no matter how horrible we are. And Lex within the contents, even of All-Star Superman, does a bunch of really horrible shit and appears to be completely, corrupted and selfish and evil and everything. But, this Leo Quintum character is ultimately like not only redeemed, but trusted by Superman to carry on his legacy. It is the least among us, the worst of his enemies, that he ultimately entrusts everything to. And I think that just adds this extra layer of power to the book and points to the idea that Lex Luthor / Leo Quintum is in fact the protagonist of the book, if you will, right? And kind of the audience stand-in as well, the cynic, the dubious person towards the whole idea of Superman, the person who can't get their head around the idea of a perfectly good person, a person who has all of this power and just wants to do good, much less a Clark Kent, right? A person who's content to be awkward and bookish and, silly, oafish person. And the interplay between those two kinds of people, right? Being content with being a normal person and also doing good when being an exceptional person, as kind of the ultimate ideal of humanity, the thing for us to aspire toward. So I do kind of want to go over 52, but not really to say anything specific about it, just to point out how good Morrison is at working with other writers and integrating their ideas and ultimately their grand narratives at this time into the work. 52, if you don't know, was a 52 issue per week project by 4 different writers, one of which was Morrison, Johns, Rucka, and Wade, I believe. And they kind of did this, again, very Ultimate Age TV show style, cross-cutting, grand narrative, right? The premise being, the Justice League are gone for a year. What the hell happens in the DC universe? We give the spotlight to all of these minor characters, and kind of see what happens to them and how those kind of interconnect by the end of things. It probably could have ultimately been a better project. By the end, it's clear that they were panicking and rushing and trying to bring things to a close. But as a grand narrative, it's very difficult to see that sort of thing happening, especially that successfully in any other medium, much less being successful and popular. And 52 also bridges Infinite Crisis, which was kind of an attempt at reconciling the Dark Age with the prior stuff, through pure continuity, and Final Crisis, which is where we're headed in terms of Morrison's work and specifically this branch of what they've been doing. And so moving forward to the other bridge to Final Crisis, but specifically Morrison's, right? We have Seven Soldiers, which might literally be their best all-in-all work. I know I say that a lot, but Seven Soldiers is insane. Essentially, the premise is we have these individual issues where we follow individual different heroes, and all of them are kind of obscure characters that are unrelated and from different genres and corners of DC history in that universe, right? It makes the whole thing feel fuller and makes you really appreciate the richness of the comic book medium and pulp storytelling, right? That malleability of what it can do. And all of these heroes, without really knowing or being aware of each other, are working towards the same goal ultimately. And the way that goal comes about and the way that good ultimately triumphs over evil is really intangible and spiritual, and then plays with ideas of fate and how things fall without us necessarily knowing how they're going to, the effect of each individual action, more than most things that I've ever experienced before. And like analyzing this specifically is difficult for me. I've only read it once up to this point, and it like blew my mind. And then I immediately reread Final Crisis and didn't really come back to it. So I do eventually probably want to do a video specifically about Seven Soldiers and kind of what it plays with specifically. But I do want to talk about the ultimate ending being more or less this character, Mr. Miracle, returning from the dead, right? So planting that seed in your head of a character dying as you normally do, right? Death and resurrection in these comic books, and escaping death, right? Like Mr. Miracle is this Jack Kirby creation from the 70s, whose entire power is being an escape artist. It has a lot of roots in Jewish culture, and specifically plays with kind of the meta-narrative of escaping from great tragedy, right? You can see like how that interconnects with like 20th century events and, you know, things Jack Kirby would have been privy to as a veteran himself. And essentially, within the way that Morrison uses it, there's this rebirth of Mr. Miracle in this modern day person, and then they are ultimately killed doing good and rise from the dead, which isn't like a hugely significant thing, obviously, in comic books, but the way that Morrison is using it and sets this concept up as a recurring motif throughout specifically this part of their run, I think is rather brilliant, and shows a lot of attention to detail in terms of planning out like not only the lore within these books, but like the thematic echoes and rhymes across these things, right? Oh shit, so like, sorry, remembering rhymes and where I was going like a really long time ago. Coming out to JLA, the actual last arc of that, right? The one that I was like, oh, well, it's just a warm up for Final Crisis and everything. It actually ends with the Justice League gifting all of the normal people on Earth the ability to be superheroes, right? For a brief period of time, which again, you know, echoes Flex Mentallo, and echoes All-Star Superman when Superman gives his powers to Lois again for a day. But specifically the imagery and everything, again, going back to what they were going for in Flex Mentallo with predicting the next era and then making it come to pass. In JLA at the end of their run, they like literally did that, echoing exactly the same image. Superheroes not as like this commanding authoritarian force, but as inspiration for normal people, and then the normal people embodying those traits of superheroes, becoming empowered through their inspiration rather than being ruled over them from above. I believe the end of Miracle Man like literally has imagery like this, except for the superheroes are like bad because they, you know, implemented their will on everybody. Miracle Man is brilliant in its own right. That's again a comic from the middle of the Dark Age by Moore. Probably the most influential comic there is, maybe more than Watchmen. It's a precursor to that. You should probably check it out. It's very depressing, but you know, ultimately it's conclusions that informed the Dark Age that ultimately power corrupts, and the superhero figure, or in this case, Captain Marvel, will ultimately seek power and kill people and become an authoritarian in terms of like initiating this utopia, is subverted over and over and over again by Morrison. And this plays into how we interact with these fictions, how our symbiotic relationship with these and our understanding of it is more complex than just missing that like people would actually be fascists if they had these powers in real life, which speaks not only to like you know, an ability to like take fiction on its own terms and take childlike wonder as a thing that can exist within that universe, right? Like good can exist within that universe, but on the other hand, this mirrors our capacity to believe in the human good, like the potential for a person to be good, I think is reflected in whether or not we can imagine a person being, a normal person being all powerful, being able to be a good person, right? Like desiring only to use those powers to help people, which I think is an important thing philosophically for us to hold on to, a faith in the common person, even though, things can be pretty bad in the world. And speaking of pretty bad, not like the work, but like what happens in it, we've got the first part of Morrison's 3-part run on Batman, and the last thing to lead into their final crisis and the end of this leg of their work, right? Which their Batman run is really, really dense and complex, and also like one of their longest works, probably the longest actually, I think, like in sheer terms of issues. But the first act is essentially the fall. Like the whole first act is like things just going worse and worse and worse and worse, right, across the entire thing, right? Deconstructing Batman from every single angle. Their philosophy famously on this Batman run is acting like literally every piece of Batman history like literally happened to Batman, because like it did, right? Like it all informs where the character currently is, so you may as well acknowledge all of it and not be embarrassed of any of it, right? Batman is so many different things, and all of these things are actually capable of being embodied in one grand story, right? Like of one person. And there's like a lot to touch on here, but like most notably, I do want to talk about the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh, which is a like backup personality that Batman created for himself, which is based on a Silver Age story in which he has like a purple and red and yellow suit in a test by a psychologist, which later it turns out has manipulated him and is saying that he's actually his father. I'm getting all these things conflated in my head, but essentially it draws from a goofy, dismissed Silver Age story and then like kind of translates it into like this like really grim imagery, which I think is like bordering, but not quite, like it's genuine in terms of pastiche, but it's bordering on like parody of like these typically like really grim and edgy versions of these heroes, right? Like Batman of Zur-En-Arrh is Batman supposedly without the Bruce Wayne, without the ability to be defeated. And again, comes back to one of the tenets that Morrison had going into this run, and kind of whenever they have written Batman more or less, which is that Batman cannot be defeated, but Bruce Wayne can, right? Like the way to actually beat Batman in any good Batman story isn't to have Batman physically beaten in an actual like prepared for a fight or whatever. It's to have him psychologically attacked from different angles, to have him broken down, right? Again, this is like a weird outlier in terms of how Morrison approaches the DC universe as a whole, right? As like this entropy towards good, because Gotham City is just like constantly going towards darkness and tragedy, right? And like the most tragic thing that they create and destroy within this this really grand odyssey that they have of Batman is Damian Wayne, right? Like his actual child, right, as opposed to the spiritual children of all the prior Robins, right? Damian Wayne is like on a literal level a product of the Bronze Age and everything, and kind of all of those Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil developments, the Ra's al Ghul, Talia, I don't know. All of those elements and everything, right? Like coming back to haunt Bruce, right? And it's ultimately like a battle for Damian's soul, with a future issue kind of showing the idea that Damian could become this guy who's taken up the mantle of Batman, but sold his soul to the devil in the process. There's this whole like fatalistic, deterministic future going on in the background of all of these Batman stories. You're wondering like how Damian will actually turn out, because like, he's this, he was raised by his mom, who is Talia, who is like this international like queen of the assassins and everything, right? Like very evil, bad person, and he's been murdered. he's been raised to brutally murder his enemies, and he's very, badass and everything. And, Batman's on the other side of things, being aware that he's had a child this entire time and trying to instill in Damian all of his normal rules and ideas of the greater good and everything. And there's this tension between, how Gotham actually is and, Batman's ideas of hope and perseverance and everything. And across specifically the next 2 volumes, after he's deconstructed so thoroughly in this first volume, you'll kind of get at the idea of whether he actually can succeed in his mission, if he actually has any sort of point, or if he's actually this hollow character within the specific world of Gotham, right? That his fight is just fruitless, that he's just almost intentionally set himself up for failure over and over again, but that's kind of the tragedy of his character, right? But again, before we get into the second and third volumes of their Batman run and kind of what those say about the character and world of Gotham, it's very telling and funny, how they play with how weird it is that Batman has his own adventures and then goes and does Justice League shit, in that they're completely deconstructed by the end of this segment of their run, but canonically they go directly from that straight into Final Crisis, which is where I'm going to start finally talking about Final Crisis, the greatest work of fiction ever of all time. And rather than just kind of ramble incoherently on Final Crisis, I'm going to literally just read a review that I wrote about it a while back, once I finally got to it, as this culmination of not just Morrison, but a lot of DC continuity, different stories and everything that I had read, because all of it feeds into Final Crisis. Before I get into the review, the part of the point of it is to really celebrate comic books as this giant monomyth, this patchwork quilt of all kinds of different stories and histories and everything, and it leans very heavily into the idea that it's very incoherent a lot of the time if you don't have the context, but that's part of the point, part of the fun of comic books is not so much contrary to popular belief, apparently, that you have to be able to pick up any given comic and instantly be able to know what's going on, have all the characters reintroduced, all of that. When you pick up an individual issue of a comic, you're jumping into the middle of a decades old story that goes, ridiculously into the future as well. And that's the beauty of it. You can't just pick up a movie and have that. You'll have 1 or 2 movies that came before it if you watch the third one, and maybe there will be a fourth one, and that's it. Even a TV show, it's often self-contained, the complexity of comic books, but specifically of these characters to this point, and as far as I can tell into the foreseeable future, is that they can have, such ridiculously complex histories, and, not to mention if you zoom out on a shared universe, you can draw from literally whatever the fuck you want to, right? All of these things exist and have coexisted, and if ostensibly they do coexist, then why not let them? Why not tell a story if you're going to tell a crisis, right? One of these giant events that DC hypes up that just integrates from all over the fucking place and doesn't feel the need to constantly explain itself and make sure that the first time reader can get everything. Because if a first time reader can get everything, that's a small universe. You're not playing into it the way it actually is, not using it to the medium and the specific universe you're acting within to the fullest extent. And with that, review. So, I've spent a year just brushing up on all the context possible to fully understand Morrison's DC saga, and this is its fulcrum point. My favorite piece of art ever, honest to fucking God. A religious experience in every sense that conveys, and something I always read in one unbroken sitting in a trance state. And while I still don't fully understand every aspect of its brilliant construction, every single choice made and detail provided, I'm about as close as I feel I ever need to get. God, comics are so fucking amazing. So, in short, what Morrison and company do here is nothing short of monumental, as a statement not just on the endurance of pop culture as meme, but on the fundamental nature of fiction itself and its naughty relation to our reality. It's maybe the most vital work on the magic of serialization, and is why these characters will never be fully captured outside of their original medium. There's simply too long a history to draw from and too much power to live up to in that cumulative effect Grant taps into here. Final Crisis is a web of time loops, taking advantage of the 4D nature of sequential art to make it exceedingly apparent that nothing ever ends, and that is why evil will never win. What the fuck is the threat of entropy to a series of events drawn on endlessly copied paper? What the fuck is a bomb to Superman? The greatest stories we tell will inspire the greatest ideas. These ideas will change our world as much as we guide the countless worlds inside our heads. The monitors are not corrupted by the germs so much as must envision themselves as the germs to transcend their comparably more severe issues. Nick's Oyotin, I never actually thought I'd say that, is the greatest of all monitors because he believes the most in stories, so much that he lives among them and therefore tells the best story in the end. The only threat that's truly existential to the DC universe is a lack of belief in their fundamental principles, the idea that to grow one must renounce the idea that good triumphs over evil, that there can be a being that is powerful and good, that a man can run faster than death itself, and that we can create our own gods, dream a dream big enough to live in and fit that dream inside our heads, right? To explain a bit of that one, the monitors are originally just one character, right? Created for Crisis of Infinite Earth, which basically initiated the Dark Age for the DC universe proper. And the monitors, monitor, right? Like they're universal forces or multiversal forces, more accurately, that watch over the entire multiverse and supposedly are supposed to kind of author the best good for the multiverse, right? And the monitors within Final Crisis are like more tangible as characters. They've become more complex, right? Like it's the metafiction that they've kind of created the fiction and then lived within it, right? They're a race that essentially works as stand-in for authors, but is like a literal, actual, outside of the multiverse proper race of actual characters with their own motivations. And within the span of Final Crisis, there is a specific monitor that is created who comes back much later in Multiversity, which I will get to, who ends up really saving the day here because of, again, his belief in stories, right? Like his ability to live within the stories and fight for them, for his fiction, rather than feel that he should just passively observe, right? At least that's from what I remember. Going back to the review. The Ultimate Age is an era I didn't fully understand in my comics journey, despite intuitively separating it from the Dark Age, and I think it's not really defined by the prevailing cinematic style of art or by the continuing deconstruction and darkness in many of the stories, but by finding a synthesis in which comics can move forward. I think Grant creates the best image of the synthesis and the merging of Ultraman and Superman, not a duality, but a symmetry. And by finding a new way to exploit the recursive nature of Golden and Silver Age comics that lent them that pure thematic focus, that sense of separation from our reality, that the tyranny of story robbed from the medium and its most popular genre leading to the work of Miller, Moore, etc., and the premature maturation and death of comic books, see the 1990s. Because, like, contrary to the belief of many, Clark Kent is not the mask and is not a burden to be Superman, or at least it doesn't have to be. What I really admire about Morrison is their acceptance of many takes on these characters and their desire to rectify these visions and celebrate the diversity inherent to serialized storytelling through the embrace of the multiverse. That there is a space for dark shit, but it should never be thought of as the only way that superheroes can exist post the Reagan years, or even as the highest way to approach these characters. What I at first misinterpreted as a firm belief in camp superiority or a wish to bring back the Silver Age is actually just a mission to broaden the scope of what superheroes can be, while maintaining that no matter what any writer does, Superman and the broader pantheon of icons can never be killed and evil can never win as long as we keep turning the page, keep imagining a better world, keep fighting no matter how dismal the situation. Only when fiction becomes chained to the limitations of reality do we lose our extremely human ability to influence that very reality with fiction. So dream on, motherfuckers. I can't say motherfucker in real life. To be continued for fucking ever. And again, that brings me back to The main point of analysis I want to make here is that Final Crisis, the event, is incomplete without Superman Beyond 1 and 2, which is kind of like this mini story, which like genuinely is doing whatever happened in The Man of Tomorrow, the Moore story again from the 80s. That is the final Superman story again, and just completely turns it on its head. And the ultimate conclusion of it, the thing that Superman uses this wish machine to win the day, and ultimately like literally just wishes the best for all of us, because that's what Superman does. And the most powerful aspect of the entirety of Final Crisis for me is what Superman inscribes on a gravestone, right? Which, you know, has deep symbolic meaning there, which is to be continued. Which again points to like everything that Morrison had been writing up to this point, and everything that they want to convey about the DC universe and its unique power, right? As kind of a amorphous, ongoing living organism that is like literally real, right? Which is, you know, to be continued on a gravestone, mirroring the slightly less, but like still a pungent symbol, but slightly less pungent because of its non-universality of Mr. Miracle and Seven Soldiers coming out of the ground, right? To be continued on a tombstone. The idea that in every death there will be a resurrection, but more like specifically that evil cannot win because like these are comic book, like you're just gonna continue the story in the next one. These things go on forever. So like the symbology, the ultimate message of Final Crisis, like in the meaning of that phrase, is that there can be no final crisis, that there's a crisis here of how to write these stories, and you know, the narrowing of like what these stories can mean and trying to give them definitive endings. And Morrison rejects that with to be continued on a tombstone, with the idea that anything can ever end in this universe, because good has already won in effect, right, for all time. Good will eventually win in the future. Good triumphs like in the short term always, but more importantly, it's where things are always headed, no matter where you are in the story. If there's a to be continued and things are dire right now, then it'll work out in the next issue. And that's the ultimate nature of comic books, regardless of how you want to write them and everything. This universe, as they've laid their stake on it, and pretty, you know, definitively, I would say, outlined, no matter how many things go bad in it and how bad things get, and how many times the villains take over for a minute, or the heroes go bad, or they all die or whatever, it's always a to be continued. And there's like so much hope and inspiration in that concept, and it helps to make like specifically the medium of comic books make sense, and how it works thematically, and that simple power of the recurring over and over and over again conflict, as being moving towards something good. But it also helps me personally to not lose hope in my own life, like in the idea that like every day is a to be continued. I mean, obviously it's not completely guaranteed, but like you go to bed at night, things suck. You wake up the next morning, you get another go at it. The tombstone and the to be continued, the idea that you don't die, right? Like until you actually do in this universe, unfortunately. But, you know, even then, if we want to take, you know, an even bigger picture, more metaphorical look at these things, you know, I'll die and Superman will continue, right? Like that's a lot of what Morrison again points to in their work, and what they celebrate about these characters as inventions of humanity that we all like, especially the writers who write on them, but everyone who even thinks or talks or imagines, right? Like helps like collectively with imagining them. We're all playing a part in a story that will outlive us, in ideas that will outlive us, right? The bomb was an idea, but Superman was a better idea. The best ideas ultimately are the ones that win out in the long term, because they're the ones that get remembered and that we continue to write stories about. And, you know, this story that these two dudes wrote in 1938 is like still the best story. Like so elemental in its simplicity and universal in its relatability that you can narrow it down to one page and get across this universal message that's like more powerful than anything you've ever heard in your life, right? Yeah, Tombstone, to be continued. That's where I was going with that. And now textually circling back to the ending of Final Crisis, which again, you know, last we saw Batman, he'd been in a weird conflict in which he seemed to have died, but hadn't died, and, you know, metaphorically he'd been thoroughly deconstructed and everything. And, you know, what else do you do but you go kill a god with a gun and a bullet that killed a god going backwards through time or something? It's hard to wrap your head around this like 4D way of storytelling Morrison does, but, you know, as we'll get into later, it kind of maps onto how they do all of this stuff. But anyway, they kill Darkseid. Darkseid is the embodiment of evil, of fascism, and it's like, you know, good triumphs over evil. It's very simple, right? The Flash outruns death. Green Lantern imagines stuff. I don't know. You know, it's Green Lantern does some stuff in there. It's all very powerful and cool. And again, circling back in a serious way, you know, in JLA, everything got bad and then things very quickly worked themselves out. At the end of Final Crisis, you have like it's 8 issues of evil winning the day, like for all time, essentially. Like they've taken over the entire world and the consciousnesses of everything. And then in like a couple of pages, like 6 of the coolest things you've ever seen in your goddamn life happen at the same time, and the heroes just win. Like they just turn everything around, and it was a JLA story the whole time. Things accumulated one after the other and built up, and then everything tumbled down like a house of cards, like so quickly. It's insane. It's over before you know it, and that's just good fucking storytelling, if you ask me. So we now have Batman dead, killing a god, and Superman cradling his dead skeleton or whatever. But, you know, again, grave tombstone, you know, like. Oh, and real quick, others have explained this way better than I have, but the entire like narrative in the Superman Beyond story, which takes place parallel to the rest of Final Crisis proper, is like metaphorically about good stories winning over cynicism and definitiveness. Yeah, I mean, I kind of summarized that with the whole grave tombstone thing, but you get the gist. Like, there's a whole meta-narrative going on there. That's why it's the Final Crisis, because it's about how you tell the story, all of that good stuff. And we are now, because Final Crisis is over, at the end of the second leg of Morrison's DC work, and hopefully the longest I'm going to go on about any of this. And like next, we follow up with Batman on the second and the middle chapter of Morrison's Batman Odyssey, right? Batman died, as we know, and Morrison takes this opportunity to kind of like reinvent Batman, because they just do that. Damian Wayne becomes Robin, his son, and then original Robin, Dick Grayson, becomes Batman very briefly. The character dynamics are like insanely good here, and it's all building towards something much more complicated, but like it's just a really good run, honestly, like in terms of how it kind of like celebrates like both the dark aspects, like really dark aspects of Batman, but still with like a very Silver Age silly sensibility. Like it's maybe peak of the run right there in terms of just being really fun to read. But while they're having their own adventures and everything, there's like a whole saga where Batman, he's not actually dead, you know, spoiler. He travels through time from the beginning of time, like a caveman, and then upward towards the present over the course of the Return of Bruce Wayne, that series, which is part of this longer Batman run. And through each of the times that he goes to, it kind of explores a different genre that influenced Batman. It's quite literally like reconstructing the character forward through time, which is amazing as an idea. And by the end of it, there's a whole existential threat and everything, as you do and everything, and Batman coming through that. And the thesis is unleashed, right? Like the positive thesis of what Batman represents and what he's actually about, right? We've been trying to figure out what makes Batman Batman and what makes him an enduring character. Is it like this elemental fight against crime and everything, the one man standing alone of it, the place that like the Dark Age had largely put him, right? Like at this time, you've had to just circle back to my Batman and Robin video years ago. This idea of Batman as fundamentally alone, right? Like the loner, like Gothic hero and everything, Gothic Gotham. That had become the most popular version of the character to this point, right? We're like knee deep in the Nolan films and everything. He's very, very serious. No room for Robin or anything. And Batman and Robin, like the series at this time, kind of reinstates that idea of him. And then the end of Return of Bruce Wayne, Bruce says that he was never alone. That was the whole point. That's circling back to the by now infamous Bell scene that's recurred like 1,000 times, but originated with Batman Year One. Again, knee deep in the Dark Ages and everything. Bruce is injured in like one of his first times trying to go out and everything, and he's bleeding out. And the Bat comes through the window, which is the Batman. But then he rings the bell to call for help from Alfred. So the ultimate point of this whole, like, you could say the whole Batman run, but specifically this part of Morrison's run, is that the defining feature of Batman is that he has help, that he has a support system around him that gives him his strength. He creates family. What saves him ultimately is those he inspires and loves, right? He's not this lone person against crime. In fact, textually, he would have died a very long time ago if he'd maintained that approach to things, right? Which is to say that the idea of Batman would have died a very long time ago without the original Robin, right? Like there's this idea of the stand-in character way back then, created for cynical reasons so that boys could identify with him when reading about Batman, and also so he didn't have to think all the time. He could like say things out loud. But ultimately, Batman and Robin is a better idea than Batman, right? I don't know if we're quite there yet in the broader culture, and even in the comic books half the time, right? It's still been an ongoing mess if you read Batman post-Morrison to like get back to that point. But I think they're correct in that. I think they're correct in that assessment that Batman and Robin is the better meme, the better idea, the thing that will outlive Batman as a concept, despite how good that idea is and how malleable it is. Yeah, that's the end of the second part of their Batman run. We're now getting deeper and more. We're on the line of where I would think their third part of their run starts. And I would say it really starts exactly where the New 52 conflicts with their Batman run, right? This is the third leg, which goes from about 2010 to like now, more or less. They've written less in this time, like a lot of substantial work, but it's mostly been smaller pieces of work rather than, well, what am I saying? They're relatively long runs, but they're kind of islands, I guess. It doesn't feel as interconnected as this middle period, and I don't know if it ever will again. There's kind of a fundamental shift in their writing following the third leg of their Batman run, which I will get into in just a second, where they shift from like, this middle period, they're like very much trying to make definitive statements on characters and everything. And then in this late period, they're like even more fully embracing the idea of other writers contributing in this universe. They're sharing, they're embracing the idea of passing on these things. And, you could argue it was maybe because they were burnt in this third leg of their Batman run, which got kind of cut short and like weirdly messed with because of continuity and editors and all of that stuff. But I don't know, honestly, and it's a really interesting evolution of their style. So again, circling back to the third leg of their Batman run and the conclusive arc, ending in tragedy again, right? Like, so fall, rise, fall is kind of the model here. Essentially in their third run, Bruce has come back like to the land of the living through like this, all time and everything. Damn it. I want to go back real quick to Final Crisis, just to dwell on this for just one moment, because again, this is just like a eternal power of art moment. So remember when I said Batman Bruce was sent back in time to the cavemen and everything? So this is actually alluded to at the end and implied at the end of Final Crisis as well, in the last pages. So they go back in time and they have like some of the items, I believe, of like the other heroes and everything, but that's beside the point. There's a caveman drawing the iconography of the DC heroes on the wall, right? Inspired, like, which is a motif as Batman goes up through the ages, that he inspires those around him and kind of builds his own myth and ultimately undoes the plot that is in the current day. Really creates it and then undoes it, which is again amazing. But yeah, he's creating sequential art as the cavemen do, which again like alludes, in my opinion, I don't know if this was intentional, but like at least from what I can tell, to the idea of sequential art and what we use for comic books being like the oldest art form, more or less, like the most elemental way that we communicate meaning, right? And again, if I go back to the tarot and everything, it's pictures in a sequence. It's pictures and symbols relating to each other. And, even without the words, you've got meaning to, like, universal meaning to a picture, right? Like across culture, across time, meaning. And that's why comic books are the best art form. Like, when used to the fullest extent that they can, it's this elemental art form going all the way back that is like a universal language when used correctly, when used like expertly and with that consideration in mind, and not as like a lower art form. I just think that's neat. So again, circling back to the third leg, Bruce has come back to the land of the living, and he's now inspired to do more as Batman. So he creates like this international, Batman Inc. is what it's called, this international like Batman in different cities and different regions of the world that work collaboratively for the good of mankind and all of that. It's very cool. Damian is also there. They're having a good time. They're getting things done. And then Talia is ultimately behind this project, Leviathan, which is kind of like, again, this global like plot that's going on, this thing for Bruce to solve. And he gets kind of like his ass handed to him a lot and gets humiliated ultimately by Talia. And specifically, like in terms of like, again, this is a really fun part of the run for the majority of it. And then it kind of just into tragedy near the end. Partially, apparently, due to the New 52 kind of interrupting it continuity-wise. Again, if you don't know, New 52 was like this 2011 project in which DC reestablished their continuity and kind of tried to streamline things and everything. But Morrison's run was like halfway in that and halfway out of it, so it kind of made it really weird because it relied a lot on a lot happening that now didn't really happen, which just makes it even weirder and more compelling, honestly, like in retrospect. But like I can imagine at the time it would have been really weird and hard to follow. But anyway, because of that, their run kind of has this idea that like all of the changes and really good aspects that they added to the mythos are like undone. Like, not that they probably knew that they weren't going to be undone or changed eventually, but like they were undone very quickly. Like the rhythm and everything of their run was kind of interrupted. So ultimately, It ends in the death of Damian, which signals this whole like failure to like grow up and communicate. Like for as good a dad as Batman kind of is, it like explores more of like the human tragedy to the idea that you've got this boy between Batman and like this assassin lady trying to like not even co-parent, but like worrying over the soul of their kid rather than just like talking or whatever. And then Talia, the way that she does reach out to Bruce and is trying to like communicate with him is by creating a plot, right? Like she's created this entire plot, as she reveals near the end, in her spare time is the quote, just to fuck with Bruce and to like that's like love and affection more or less to her, which is, a reflection on Bruce and Batman's like eternal shortcomings as a character. It's interesting, again, as an outlier, because Morrison is doing deconstruction in a way that they haven't really around. Like they've been doing the reconstruction and the metatext and everything, but not like pulling apart the flaws of these characters in this way for a very long time up to this point. So that's why it kind of hits like a sledgehammer. And again, specifically the language that Talia uses when she's kicking Bruce's ass is the idea that like at any given time he could get into these kind of global games and like really make a difference, but instead he's playing in the mud with like his freak friends, right? Like he's like, from a certain perspective, trapped himself within this kind of eternal fight within Gotham because he like wants to punish himself, or because he enjoys that game or whatever. It's like a reductive way of looking at things, but it's very chilling and like an existential way, I guess. Like on a metatextual level, it points to this idea that we as readers are reading the same things happening over and over again in like these smaller scale things, again, as a matter of escapism from real things we could be solving. It's heartbreaking, and like it ultimately ends in like almost an inverse message that this never ends, that this will just keep going on forever beyond this storyline, and that for Bruce, that's not like a really cool thing that's inspiring to us. That's really tragic. Like tragic things are just going to keep happening to him. Trauma is just going to keep fucking him up forever. Speaking of which, did you know in the Final Crisis, he fucking killed a guy, a god actually, with his trauma? Like the guy tried to like invade his mind to make Batman clones, and he killed him because Batman's had so much like trauma over decades and like, hyper compressed. It just like, I thought that was really cool, But anyway, Batcal, even within like the end of this run being such a dour, like existentially terrifying note, you've still got like notes of absurdism, and it kind of reminds you that like ultimately Morrison is still kind of playing with the form here, and it's still very much a fun thing to read despite the pain, which like properly leads us into their third tier of their work, again going from like 2010 to now, and a handful of select titles that I'll kind of go over. I'll start on their run on Action Comics, which is their third take on Superman, JLA, All-Star Superman, Action Comics, and Superman and the Authority, which we will get to later. But Action Comics is the New 52 title Morrison got to write, which focuses on the early days of Superman, and very much is like a punk version. Like they took the idea that Superman in their early like couple of issues, like you have to go back to the literal first ones, I recommend it, was like beating on like factory owners and landlords and shit. Like he was more of like politically a man for the people, like very definitively. So the beginning of Morrison's run on Action Comics flirts with this idea. It doesn't really go all the way with it a lot of the time. A lot of it is kind of like tangential to the plot and everything, but the spirit of their Superman as they are writing it here is to kind of emphasize that aspect of the character, taking kind of the invulnerability and the omnipresence and all of that stuff down a peg in terms of this interpretation of Superman, and upping the punk against the establishment, doing good for the people, like in a very like direct way, like making that the forefront. Which, like, their run, again, I believe was also cut short on this one. But like throughout the arcs following the first one, I think it ran for like 18 issues or something. I don't know. It wasn't that long of a run, but like, substantial enough. They do play with like a bunch of other ideas that have come up in Superman's past and everything, and it's a very complex story in its own right. But it feels like, aside from making a mission statement in the beginning, they have like less to prove here. Like they've already done the definitive version of this character, more or less, like, from their perspective. And here they're playing more with the idea of a looser approach to the storytelling that's like less concerned with, themes and everything. Like it does very much feel like they've loosened up, and that kind of sets the tone for this next leg of their career as a little bit more, I don't know, playing nice with other writers, like sharing a bit more, establishing worlds and characters specifically because they want other people to take them and run with them later, rather than feeling the need to like do something significant with them right now. And that brings us to Multiversity, which is kind of like the ultimate example of that idea. Like, they do a lot of very definitive things in Multiversity, but the prime reason for Multiversity, which again, may be their magnum opus, I'm not entirely sure. The primary reason for Multiversity existing is to like, one, categorize a bunch of like the different multiversal ideas around the DC universe, right? Like these different genres and different aspects of their history and where they go and how they all fit, all that good stuff. But also to like set the tone for different worlds, which are just open sandboxes for other writers, some of which have been like taken on, and some of which sadly like it went the way of Limbo. Limbo was also a device from Final Crisis, and also Animal Man. Limbo being the device that Morrison uses for characters that nobody writes anymore. It's a place where nothing ever happens because nobody is writing anything. You get the gist. It's a fun device. A lot of the characters in Multiversity, I feel like, are in Limbo now, and that's fine until eventually somebody comes along and does something with it. The concept of Multiversity itself, and kind of like its map of the multiverse and the overarching narrative there, has been very influential and cited by a lot of different stories in the decade since. But what I do want to focus on with Multiversity is literally one issue, Pax Americana. Maybe my favorite issue of anything, you know the drill. Maybe my favorite issue of a comic book. Pax Americana is like, again, indulging in that thing that they essentially stopped doing except for with works of more, which is, again, pastiche, parody, all of that good stuff. With Pax Americana, they take the characters, the Charleston Comics characters that Watchmen's characters were originally going to be and then were based on, and uses those to parody Watchmen, which is like amazing. It's like such a good concept. They're once again working with Frank Quitely, who in this case like puts in like the best fucking art of all time, like in terms of how they tell the story. And notably they use 8-panel grids rather than 9-panel grids. The idea behind this is more that comics are a cycle, and the whole concept of Multiversity very much plays with the idea that the reader is actively engaged in the work and actively, like, literally, like, creating the story. Like, your observation and consumption of a story and how you choose to read it is determining the fate of the thing in your hands. Right? It plays with that in, like, fun ways, but also, like, terrifying ways. And again, at the center of this is Pax Americana, which is, like, again, just taking Watchmen, which is like 12 issues, right? And like a lot of like extra text and everything, and condensing like the power of that and kind of doing a subversion of it while also like doing everything it did just as well in one issue. Like I can't, I'm just gushing over this. It's amazing. I've read it like a million times, even well before I was like a Morrison head. It was like my favorite thing, which is funny because like in many ways I still don't understand exactly what it's saying thematically. Like it's a very emotional experience, and it's very clear that it's playing with like the idea of stepping outside of time and like seeing everything in like a 4D manner and everything, like breaking and transcending that, and you know, does that through the form. But as far as what it's saying like thematically about like, you know, the Kennedy assassination and the ensuing like state of things, neoliberalism, all of that stuff, I'm not quite there yet, honestly. Hopefully I will be someday, but that just speaks to, again, the depth of these stories that you can like when this person wants to do it, and they're collaborating quietly, of course, they can just make something that's completely inscrutable to me, even despite feeling it on like a guttural level. Like, and again, this is more or less a very, you know, dour comic and an outlier in the sense that it plays into that dourness. But it's still like just so it just makes me believe in the power of the power of art, like so much, that it can't help but fill me with hope, even as it fills me with dread for everything in multiple universes and realities. I also want to talk about Wonder Woman Earth 1 real quick, which reminds me a lot of Miracle Man somehow in structure, but also Action Comics and what it's trying to do with taking Wonder Woman back to her roots in bondage and BDSM, and sexuality, which is such a core tenet of how Wonder Woman works as a character. If you go back and read those comics, that it starts to make sense why, like, out of the Trinity and even the broader pantheon of the JLA, she's oftentimes like just not that interested, like in the popular culture at least. I'm sure there are great stories about her, but there's not a lot to go on, and I feel like it's partially because she's so stripped of that core part of her identity. Like, it just couldn't continue to exist, I guess, in a corporate kid-friendly medium. Like, she was just too subversive and weird. But Morrison takes the freedom of this alternate reality of Earth 1, like, to really just go crazy with it. It's also got a lot of what at this point I'm going to call like late stage Morrisonisms, in that they're playing with like popular culture and a lot of like inscrutable like cringe elements, like almost purposely cringe. Like it's very, very modern, in ways that sometimes like seem like really awkward and incongruous with the rest of what they're trying to pull off, like the classicalism of the form and like the power and archetypicalness of Wonder Woman mixed with this, like, you know, delving into like incels and right-wing shit and everything, and the way that Wonder Woman yells "Ola" all the time as like a battle cry. It's awesome. I love it. I just don't understand, and that's part of why I like it so much. It's really good. It ends in like utopia again, mirroring Miracle Man, and that also ends in utopia. But this is like a positive utopia, like a feminist utopia, like for real. And completing this trilogy, starting with Action Comics and then Wonder Woman Earth 1, we've got the Green Lantern, which they are on for 4 entire volumes worth of comics. The Green Lantern is still like complicated, but it does, you know, in its essence, take Hal Jordan back to his roots as kind of like this space cop, right? Like doing detective work and getting in really weird adventures, but like again borrows from like the concept of like the JLA run, in that it takes these archetypical stories and just makes them like completely insane in terms of just maximalism and everything. And then by the end of the run, it's devolving into very clear Arkham Asylum style art. Like that's clearly what they're going for. I don't know why. It's a lot of stuff happens and it's very weird, very entertaining. And it's hard to like pick apart thematically again. Like there's just a lot of very straightforward like adventure shit going on in it, and I'm sure there's a lot going on underneath the surface, but similar to, again, Action Comics and Earth One, this feels very much like Morrison playing nice, like not trying to make definitive statements or metatext, but just very much embracing the serialized nature of these characters and their stories. Which brings me to like the ultimate example of this, which is Superman and the Authority. Their fourth take on Superman, this time a depowered version, or, you know, waning in power, that's like visibly older and everything, and, you know, feeds into the thematic idea of, you know, these older statesmen of comic book writers coming back to a character they've left such a mark on and getting to make one final statement with them. And ultimately, it's about letting go and letting the next generation handle it, which was like surprising. But then, like, again, in the grand scheme of this leg of their career, it makes like perfect sense. Superman kind of like assembles a team of less than like perfect people, which again like feeds into like this completely redeeming everyone eventually aspect of their character, as written by Morrison. Specifically Black Cassidy, who was infamously in the Superman versus the Elite issue way back when, the one that movie was based on, which was What's So Funny About the Truth, Justice, and the American Way. And in this case, like, Superman doesn't even like beat, you know, this metaphorical, like, darker, like, different kind of superhero that's like supposed to replace him. He just like inspires him, right? Like, just puts him on his seat. Like, he's just so good that he just, you know, also becomes good with him, right? And like at the end of the run, it's just kind of a between story. It's just between two different parts of another writer's run, and kind of like acting as setup for something for someone else to do. And interestingly, we have the Ultra Humanite here at this point, which is the oldest Superman villain, which I thought was a thing Morrison knew specifically, and like they were using them, but like this person just pops up everywhere. Like they're just a weird gorilla now. It's very interesting that they go back forever, like older than Lex Luthor, but nobody even knows that. But anyway, gorilla sighting, like as I was getting into, or whatever it is. But essentially Brainiac's got this whole plan and everything, and it's this whole like doomsday thing and all of that, right? And Superman's just like, my son will handle it, goodbye. Like he just puts his faith in someone else to save the day. He just feels good leaving it behind. And if All-Star Superman could be, you know, said to be on some level about the fear of death and like the inability to trust others to do the job when you're gone, right? Which, you know, even back then culminates in Superman making our world in order to see if we'd be okay without him. It turns out like, yeah, Superman inspires people, and if Superman doesn't exist, we will create the idea of Superman, and the idea of Superman is the powerful thing, the thing that inspires us and helps us to transcend our boundaries and believe that we can be better. And here, you know, Morrison just depicts that slightly differently, like as the writer who can now pass things on to another person who doesn't have to have the definitive statement and have this conclusion to this arc, because they're embracing that idea that they played with way back when of this, you know, ongoing quilt, even more so than they did back then, right? Like not even having to have a definitive statement, just passing it on, just playing the role of a stock writer, which, you know, is an honor when you actually have the perspective on it, when you have the perspective that you get a role in this really, really long story and this grand narrative. Like any amount of art that you can create that is this huge collaborative experience, like between dead people and soon to be alive people and much later people. Like, you're in that. You don't have to focus on getting everything out of your head, because you're part of the this human contribution, like this overarching contribution by humanity to creating these ideas, to keeping them alive and developing them, and then passing the torch and not worrying about what the outcome even is, just moving on to the next thing. And speaking of next thing, the most recent piece of work that Morrison did for DC was DC Pride 2023 last year, which is a like multiversal love story, like told across a couple of pages. Not a lot there. Like it's great. Like, to be clear, it's really good. But not a lot there thematically, I would say, that's new. But it does end in to be continued, which I think again points to this idea that they're very much taking this idea of an endless cycle of stories going on forever, that they set up in the second leg of their career, and applying that to their own work philosophy in this third leg, which may be still ongoing, maybe not. I don't know if they'll be doing a lot of work in the future, but that seems to be where things were always headed, the way things evolved. Like, they went from relatively juvenile philosophy towards writing where they're trying to like up the ante in terms of deconstruction and metatext, to embracing these characters on their own terms, and more importantly, like the universe on its own terms, right? To like letting go and like doing that part while also enabling other writers to pick up the slack to move to the next thing that they want to tell. Being a bit more humble and just trusting and like humanity to take this over, to take it to the next level, and to take these ideas in the future. Understanding that their place, while obviously very influential on myself, will never be as influential as all of these characters that they've wrote on. All of these ideas, these memes, will long outlast them. And that's a lot of why I like them so much, because they are one of the few people who seems to fully understand that and appreciate this specific value and the specific magic of the comics medium, and of the DC universe, and of collective universes in general. And specifically the way that they approach the medium outside of this, right, as a collection of sequential symbols rather than, story plot. The symbols as informing the way that you write the character. The pages and pages and pages of super gods, which I barely even got into, where they just gush over every individual detail and its meaning of the original issue of Superman, the original issue of Batman, the connections between these things and our myths and our different visual iconography representing all of these different themes, and pop art's specific advantages at conveying information and carrying ideas in ways that can be very easily understood by the maximum amount of people. The power in symbols and simplicity as the building blocks of great art, and art and ritual as virtually indistinguishable. That the reader, the viewer, the audience is an active participant in what they choose to take part in. That we're creating art together through our collective human experience, through imagining together, and that this imagination, these worlds that we create collectively, have like literal, like actual material impact on where our world goes, because how we can imagine and what we can imagine and our capacity to suspend our disbelief to believe in something that we can't see in front of us is like vital to our ability to maintain our humanity in the future. like indispensable from any hope we have of creating a better world, and a world that looks like the alternative most of the time, that looks like a supervillain's wet dream. Which is why I must believe that the idea of Superman is better than the idea of the bomb, that the kindness and love and goodness and aspiration within each and every one of us, our capacity for cooperation, our individual strength when we rely on each other, family that we can build together is stronger and better and just generally more eternal than anything else. I want to believe that when I read the comics of Grant Morrison, and when I think about the world from the perspective and using the lessons that their art and their writings have taught me up to this point. It's invaluable, and it's an ongoing process that I get more and more out of, not just when I consume their art, but when I consume art in general, while thinking the way that I feel that I've been armed to think. And the best part of it is that, again, it's an artist that doesn't feel like I have to get everything specifically from them, but like, rather than monopolizing what I think about and becoming indispensable, arms me with the ability to think of everything as interlinked and interconnected, of nothing as unimportant or beneath my consideration, that everything that I do every day is a ritual, that the things that I repeat consciously or not are powerful and influential, ultimately maybe the most important things that I do, that everything that we think and we feel and we do with each other, the actions that we take, are part of this grand collective story. And that story is bigger than anything we can touch or feel. It's infinite worlds in our heads.